Good evening. I'm Aaron Pallas, the chair of the Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis at Teachers College, Columbia University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel on visions of teacher unionism. The panel was conceived by EPSA faculty member Kevin Doherty and Mimi Lyon, a recent doctoral graduate from our department. It's been a long time coming. That pesky pandemic resulted in a lengthy delay, but we are delighted that we can now have you join us. A recent Gallup poll found that 68% of Americans approve of labor unions, which is the highest percentage that Gallup has recorded since 1965, and well above the all-time low of 48% observed in 2009. Yet relations between local governments and teacher unions remain fraught. Over the past 3 years, local branches of either the National Education Association or the American Federation of Teachers initiated strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky, and Los Angeles and Chicago, among other venues. Our panelists tonight include two union leaders who have been involved in these strikes. Stacey Davis Gates is the vice president of the Chicago Teachers Union and the executive vice president of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. In the fall of 2019, she helped to lead a 15-day strike and to negotiate an historic contract that provides for smaller class sizes, ensures a nurse and social worker in every Chicago public school, secures sanctuary protections for immigrant families, and supports students and families experiencing homelessness. In 2017, Ms. Davis Gates was elected chair of United Working Families, an independent political organization by and for working class people and the labor movement. She also serves as a board member for the Action Center on Race and the Economy, a nexus for organizations working at the intersection of the struggle for racial justice and Wall Street accountability. Jay O'Neill is a middle school teacher and union activist in Charleston, West Virginia. He is perhaps most known for his leadership role in the West Virginia teacher strikes in 2018, which secured a 5% raise in teacher salaries across the state. Because of his role in this teacher strike, he was named to the 2019 Time Magazine 100, along with fellow West Virginia teacher Emily Comer. We also have two other New York metro area teacher union activists with distinctive points of view. Cara Popiel is the executive vice president of the Yonkers Federation of Teachers in Yonkers, New York, the third largest city in New York State. Over the course of her 32-year teaching career, she has taught English to speakers of other languages around the globe. Cara first became active in the teachers union after participating in the Yonkers teachers strike in 1999. Dr. Popiel earned her EDD in organization and leadership at Teachers College in 2010. Her work has been published in Journal of Educational Change, as well as the edited volume, Teacher Unions in Public Education, Politics, History, and the Future. Gia Lee has been a New York City special education teacher since 2001 and a chapter leader in the United Federation of Teachers for 12 years. In 2011, she began organizing with parents, fellow educators, and community members as a member and leader of the movement of Rank and File Educators Caucus in the United Federation of Teachers, which champions social justice issues such as underfunding of schools, democratic participation, and education for liberation. A staunch opponent of high-stakes standardized tests, Gia is a former candidate for president of New York City's United Federation of Teachers and ran for lieutenant governor of the state of New York on the Green Party line. Teachers College professor Nancy Lesko, Maxine Green Professor for Distinguished Contributions to Education, and chair of TC's Department of Curriculum and Teaching, will be a synthesizer for each phase of the discussion. Nancy is renowned for a long-standing program of research on curriculum history and theory, gender and masculinity in schools, and how we think about childhood and adolescence. Mimi Lyon will serve as the moderator of the discussion. Melissa Arnold-Lyon, who goes by Mimi, is a postdoctoral research associate at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University and recently earned her PhD from our department at Teachers College. She studies the political economy of education, focusing in particular on inequality, governance, and teacher politics and policy. Much of her recent work has focused on teacher unionization. Prior to graduate school, she taught middle school and was an instructional coach in Houston, Texas. Mimi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm thrilled to be here today, and this panel comes at a really critical moment in time when strikes are on the rise and teacher labor in particular is facing new challenges as organizers, union members, and leaders across the country grapple with changes to the nature of labor and society. I'm really honored and humbled to be talking with such an amazing set of leaders. And before we start, I want to give an overview about how the conversation will be structured. We'll begin with a set of prepared questions on 4 critical topics in teacher unionism today: coalition building, racial justice, the COVID-19 pandemic, and union tactics. For each of these topics, I'll ask one panelist to start and then follow up with our other panelists. Then, for the last 15 minutes of the panel, we'll ask our panelists to respond to some questions submitted from you in the audience. So I'll go ahead and get started. For our first topic, I want to focus on coalition building. I'll direct my initial question to you, Stacy. To what extent should teachers' unions engage in coalitions with parents, other labor groups, and community organizations?
So I'll start by saying that I don't know how to do this work without the coalition. So asking me this is fundamentally, it's difficult for me to imagine doing this work in any other way. Our leadership, once led by Karen Lewis, saw very critically the need to have voices who were impacted by the policies that we would either challenge or we would embrace. And we understood the complexity of our school communities and the necessity to have all voices represented. In fact, what I would say is that CTU joined the coalition that was already moving, quite frankly. We were invited in, and we have become a partner in the coalition that was already formed. So the need for coalition work for us, to be honest with you, has dovetailed into what people perceive as the power. I would say that a better way of thinking about this is that we are a part of a community, that we are making sure that we are a part of solutions that are self-determined by those who will experience the most impact, either positively or negatively, from the policies that we are championing. So real fast, our ability to put together contract demands, they don't just come from those who are instructing or working inside of school buildings, but they also come from those that we are in coalition with. Our work with students, what we hear from students, how the school community can work better if we're doing this work. And even bigger, it's not just the schools Chicago students deserve. It is also a fact that we are working for the city all Chicagoans deserve. So coalition work, I don't know, that's the only type of unionism I know.
That's great. So I'd like to shift to some of the other panelists now too. Jay, in about 5 minutes or so, can you give your reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we have to work to build coalitions as much as possible. I mean, you've simply got more collective power when you've brought together a broad group of people. I will say, I think sometimes people try to draw a line between our interest as teachers and the interests of the broader community. And I think it's really important that we push back against that. For instance, it's okay to acknowledge that we need higher salaries because teachers that don't have to work 2 jobs are more effective in the classroom. So I don't think our interests are really separate from those of the greater community, and I think teachers almost really more than any other type of workers are rooted in the community. Like we have that community access that many workers don't. And I think it's really important that we use it. You know, here in West Virginia, before we went on strike in 2018, we worked with parents and organizations like churches, community centers, to set up feeding and childcare stations for the duration of the strike. You know, we made clear our strike wasn't out to hurt them, that it would actually benefit them as well. And we had a ton of support from parents and community members and even other unions. You know, both the UMWA and the Teamsters came out and supported us while we're on strike. So I think that's got to be one of the things that we have to do as unions moving forward is, you know, educate the public on why the issues we're fighting for matter to them, and then continually be reaching out and trying to bring in new groups and build new coalitions. I mean, basically just think like organizers.
And so, Gia, can you help us to think about how coalition building is or should be playing out in New York City in the way that you see it?
Wow, thanks. And I have to echo what Stacy and Jay are talking about. And to be clear, the movement of rank and file educators is a caucus within our union. And so often we're thought of as dissidents. But with that said, we've noticed that since we formed, parent organizations here in New York City reach out to us in support of just what we would deem like basic rights for education, for housing, for healthcare, infrastructure, et cetera. And so coalitions are about the common good. And really, instead of like factioning us off, the divisions have been created to pit us against each other by, I would, just call them out, the top, 1%, the elite, the corporate powers that be, in their efforts to privatize public education, healthcare, et cetera. And in New York City, I'm glad you wanted to put this in context. We have almost 200,000 members in the United Federation of Teachers with 1.2 million students in the system. And to put in broader context, like Brooklyn is about the size relatively in numbers with Chicago. So we're talking about a huge system. And in like 2016, the Fiscal Policy Institute issued a report stating that New York State led the nation in income inequity. So if we want to talk about who needs to coalesce together, right, it's all of like the working and poor class, right, if you want to put them that way, and create a pushback system to fight and demand for greater equity and resources and access to all of the things that we know our students, our communities, our schools, our hospitals, everyone deserves.
And so Gia, can you think of some specific like coalition building activities that you'd like to see union members in New York engaging in, or that you have seen union members in New York engaging in?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll put this, I know we'll talk about COVID, but when we were looking at COVID and the safety of the schools, the parent organization Press, the Parents Parents for Responsive and Equitable Safe Schools, Press NYC, formed immediately. And the first group they came to was us. We had the inside information for the conditions in the buildings. Parents knew from us that the buildings were not safe prior to COVID. They wanted to know ventilation issues. So our union leadership, I'll be frank, was not very, generous with the information. It was us, those of us on the ground. So we band together and started organizing for a safe school reopening. Without that, I don't think we would have been able to shut down the schools back in March of 2020. That's just one example. We can go back. New York State just won over after like 15, 20 years of fighting for billions of dollars that were owed New York State's public schools and millions for New York City's public schools. We were the ones organizing with the Alliance for Quality Education and the Coalition for Educational Justice to to do the kind of organizing that needed to be done in the local districts and pressure our elected officials to pass and force the hand of the state government to release the funds. And this past year, we had a huge success. It happened. And this is in line with the students and the parents. And without that, I don't think that we would have been successful.
I think that's a great point. And something that I noticed that you brought up that reminded me of something Jay mentioned too, was how the parents came to you. And so I'm wondering if, Jay, in your experience, was that the case that the parents and community members and other labor groups that you mentioned came to you? Or did you as an organizer like make explicit efforts to go out and do broader community organizing? Like, how does it I want to hear a little bit of your take on that kind of push and pull.
Yeah, it was both. During our strike, we were more reaching out to them because we knew it was imminent, it was coming. But, and I know we're going to talk about COVID in a minute, but with COVID, I think it sounds a lot like what Gia's talking about. We had parents coming to us immediately because they were very concerned about school reopening. This is kind of the summer of 2020 time. And so, yeah, again, I think we kind of sometimes in the media get pitted against each other, but reality on the ground is like parents want safe schools, teachers want safe schools, and we can really work, together hand in hand on that.
And so, Nancy, now I want to ask you to help us process this in the context of social movements a little more generally. And I'm wondering if you have specific thoughts regarding the potential for coalitions of teachers and parents and community groups. And I'm thinking specifically of some of what I know you and I have talked about before in terms of the opt-out movement, or with regard to environmental concerns, how we could think about teachers' unions as players in these broader social movements, and what we can learn from other social movements to try to understand teacher labor right now in terms of coalition building.
Yeah, thanks, Mimi. I'm not sure I can answer all of those questions, but I do have a couple of comments just on the responses that we heard, which is clearly that coalitions are central to what's going on. And in thinking before this panel tonight, I was thinking about kind of the idea of kind of coalitions within, or what Angela Davis wrote about as the intersectionality of struggles. And I know that people have written about the 2018 teacher protests as, inspired by drawing energy from other movements such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the March for Our Lives, Dreamers, and I think also the opt-out movement. And so I think that that's part of what seems to me so important about teacher activism and right now is that ability to bring those intersections together, as people have already talked about, and the importance of that. So I just am really echoing what other people have said, and I was really gratified to hear people also name students and young people as part of those coalitions, because I think often our young people and children may be seen as kind of the folks for whom these actions will benefit, that we're doing them, but sometimes are sidelined as important participants themselves. So I think it was really important to mark youth and students as well.
Thanks. And so now I also want to focus in on what I guess some may interpret as a specific type of coalition, really focusing specifically on racial justice and how and what teachers' unions should be doing in the fight for racial justice. And so I want to start really big picture, and I'll let you take this one first, Stacey, again. What role do you see for teachers' unions in the fight for racial justice?
Well, here's the thing. So I'm going to make it more micro and then perhaps a bit more macro. So a couple of years ago, we changed our constitution in Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union, and we explicitly stated that we would be working for that our job was to work for racial, social, and economic justice. So we named it, right? So we took a space, our union, back in 2010, and a few years later, we named that this union will explicitly do that work. Why is that important? Well, we're in Chicago, Illinois, the third largest city in the country, and the vast majority of our students, 90% of them, are non-white. And so if we see the struggle for educational justice, then we also have to see the struggle for racial justice. We have been an incubator for the massive experimentation that is also called education reform. And it was easy to do it because they were doing it on Black and brown children. It's always easy to do these types of experiments on those you see as most vulnerable, those you see as most needy, and in a world, in a society that is rooted in white supremacy and patriarchy. So if we are saying explicitly that there is a way to do public education that centers common good, meaning students should have and their families access to affordable housing, that we should be working explicitly to ensure their social and emotional stability. If we are saying that all of these things are important, then you also have to name white supremacy as an impediment to those things and work explicitly to eradicate it. And that's what we've done. Why is it important? Well, it can't just be an external message into the world either. It's not good enough for us to call the district out or the mayor, who is our boss, out for not behaving in anti-racist ways, right? It is also something for us to do because we too are an institution in a society undergirded by white supremacy. So there are structures even within our union that don't speak to the type of world we want to see. So it's also a responsibility that we have to investigate our own practices. So what types of cases are we taking on as a union? What are we defending? What are we saying that that's a bridge too far? So that's one example. I think another example is how are we giving platform, resources, and amplification to culturally relevant pedagogy? How are we offering development for our members in that way, right? And how are we confronting issues? Like, we're never not going to have a situation in Chicago where our union is not dealing with race and white supremacy, from selective enrollment schools to the way in which schools are under-resourced through student-based budgeting schemes.
And I want to follow up with you. I think you're right that you and the other teachers and union members in Chicago have been at the forefront of talking about and putting a microphone to the notion of common good unionism and making the explicit connections between education and racial justice and teachers' responsibilities. I want to know, what are some of the challenges that you faced in terms of being that, I think, really being at the forefront of coming out and saying, making these connections between our educational system and white supremacy?
Look, everyone's not bought in, to be honest with you. We have different contingencies even within our membership who require more time to unpack what this means for them explicitly. And then you also get a bad rap publicly, right? So we will have a very established media push back on us saying Black all the time, or brown all the time, or equity or justice all the time. We will be cast as a villain, or you would get quizzical looks from those who believe that your only place as a labor union is within the bread and butter of pay, wages, and benefits, right? And that you have no place in speaking to the issues of Black and brown children and families in this city. Well, here's the thing too. Union leadership at CTU is 3/4 women of color. So for us to not bring ourselves, our experiences, our families with us in our leadership is completely unreasonable. And as union leadership continues to reflect the demographics of the city and of our country, these are instances where what has been a model, an antiquated model of just male white union leadership, it's going to be challenged with the types of policies and the structures that have survived and perhaps shouldn't have survived. So I would say, just like any institution in America, especially in this time period, we are all challenged and will continue to be challenged. I would say, though, that is a good challenge to have. And I am proud of our union for confronting that struggle head on, not just calling out, what's external to us, but also struggling inside of our union to create a space where people like me have voice, to create a space where we are challenging the model that you can't say Black, you can't say brown, and even that you can't say no to forced experimentation on Black children.
Mm-hmm. And so thanks. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And so now I want to also pass it to Cara and want to ask the same question, and also with a specific focus on the efforts that you are making within the Yonkers Federation of Teachers to in some of your specific work, examples of how you've tried to integrate an emphasis on racial justice in the work that you've done with teachers and with professional development.
Yeah, I have to say, I absolutely agree with Stacy. And one of the things that we've been doing in Yonkers is really looking to educate our own members, to educate teachers about culturally responsive teaching practices and about their own implicit bias. I think it's a very scary thing for people to look at, for teachers to look at, and it's so important. Nothing's going to change unless we're able to look at ourselves and become self-aware and then change our teaching practices. So in our partnerships, one of our strengths in Yonkers, and by the way, Yonkers is 77% of our students are students of color, and only 28% of our teachers are teachers of color. Which is another thing I'll actually get to in a moment, that I'm very proud of what we're doing there. But in terms of professional development, a lot of our partnerships with the district even center around professional development. So it's a great opportunity where we can have a voice without a fight, without having to be out there on our own doing this. I think it's a push that the district is making too, which is great. It's a way to forge that relationship and provide professional development for our teachers. So our teacher center, for example, is offering more classes on culturally responsive teaching practices and looking at your own, reflecting on your own teaching practices. More than we've ever done before. It's been a big push of ours for the past few years, knowing how important it is, and also making professional development around making students feel safe. So this is something that I think all teachers want, and it's a great in to then help teachers look at how you make that happen. And then you can start to really address the harder questions about race, about any marginalized group of students. Our non-binary students are, we're doing a lot of professional development on how to address other groups of students, all differences in a way. And we have to make it safe, I think, for people to do that.
And I do want to also give you the chance to talk about the hiring programs. I think that is a really critical piece of this that teachers and their unions have to deal with, which is the very white nature of the teacher workforce and the increasingly less white and much more Black and brown nature of the student body. So I wonder if you could also talk on that.
Sure, absolutely. It's there's a push on the state level. Our New York State United Teachers, our state organization, take a look at teaching. So we're trying to improve diversity in the workplace. which is also, it addresses the teacher shortage. It addresses, it addresses the teacher shortage, but at the same time, we're trying to bring our own students into the teaching profession. We have a grant through NEA. They have a Grow Your Own grant, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to get partnering with our My Brother's Keeper program, partnering with student advocacy programs within our city. We're trying to get our students of color to take a look at teaching, to become teachers, and to do more on behalf of their own communities to change the face of the teachers' workforce. We believe that that's an important part. Getting teachers of all colors to look at their own implicit bias is one step, but really helping the teaching population look more like the student population is definitely a long-term goal that we have to address now.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Now, Gia, would you like to comment on the role of teachers' unions in the fight for racial justice and how you have worked towards racial justice in some of your own work with the Moore Caucus?
Sure. It is really important to understand that we have a legacy in this country. It's founded on white supremacy and racism. And I think that as we look out through history, the resistance is what we focus on in educating our students. Not that we had Africans that were brought over and enslaved and the atrocities, those were absolutely horrible, but to focus on teaching our students how people continue to fight and struggle, build coalitions to push back. And I say that because our own structures within our union, very top-down bureaucratic unions that exist all across in every single sector, are by design, started well over 50 years ago, that need to be undone, because that was part and parcel in stamping out. For example, in New York State, it's illegal for us to go on strike. We can be fined heavily when that is the main mode of our ability to fight back. That is racist. When a large swath of the population that we work with are students of color, and we want to fight back on policies that are institutionally racist. And and I've heard this argument about bread and butter unionism versus social justice unionism. I would argue bread and butter issues are social justice and racial justice issues. Absolutely. There is no dichotomy. And for anyone to create that dichotomy is part of the problem. In New York City, the Moore Caucus, we're rooted in founding the BLM at Schools chapter, where we hold a series of events throughout the year. One of the major ones is our social justice curriculum fair. And that's a space where educators can come together to share pedagogy, curriculum in a safe space. And we meet lots of teachers who say, this is amazing. I want to learn more, but I teach in a school where we're under really crazy accountability systems, and my administrator would never allow this. The focus is on teaching to the test, for example, trying to get out of being designated school under, improvement or whatever new acronym is labeled upon schools that have not shown test score growth. And so there's a hypocrisy in a lot of our big bureaucratic systems that say, yes, we want more culturally responsive teaching, more anti-racist professional development, and at the same time continue to pressure us into teaching to the test without the examination of how racist that is, and even administrative practices of not fostering democracy in a school, constantly having to push back against abusive administrators is a problem. It's a hypocrisy we need to get through and somehow unveil. I don't know how to do that right now. I think it's school by school. But I think we need to share the organizing strategies to do this work.
So now I think, Nancy, it might be nice for you to chime in and help us to step back and see the big picture in terms of the roles and responsibilities of teachers in terms of working towards dismantling systems and structures of white supremacy within our schools and within our societies. And I'm wondering, specifically thinking about schools, if some of your work on anti-racism in teaching is relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of the speakers who gave those really inspiring comments. I agree that, changes to what we consider to be the standard curriculum are absolutely essential. That includes, obviously, as Gia was talking about, testing, but it also includes, I think, the canons and traditions of specific subject areas, what's counted as history, what's counted as English language arts, etc. I think it also involves the systems of control using extreme punishments under zero tolerance. And then I think, as other people have talked about, as pedagogical practices. So I think revising schools really is completely remaking schools in certain ways are absolutely necessary in all of those different areas. And I consider them to all be part of the curriculum, kind of what schools teach and how they teach it. And I think that, as I'm thinking about these efforts of unions, I just wonder how this work towards curricular revisions and questioning of testing, et cetera, questioning of extreme punishment systems, are in turn kind of undermined by or threatened by the fear mongering that goes on around particular teaching practices or teaching or our particular curriculum. So here I'm thinking, of course, about the recent attacks on critical race theory, and not that, in my view, no one is promoting that we teach critical race theory, but I think that mobilizing of that fear seems to be really powerful in sort of raising questions, very publicly expressed questions and concerns about these curricular changes that are absolutely essential. And I think sort of being able to talk back to those fears without discounting them, perhaps, but also to hold to these curricular changes, these broad curricular reforms, I think are part of what teachers and teacher unions kind of face today.
And so we've kind of been building to this in some ways, and I think points that have been made about student interests being pitted against teachers' interests, and also this notion of bread and butter unionism being able to be kind of the same as social justice movement is a nice transition as we start to think about or talk more specifically about the COVID-19 pandemic and how teachers' unions have addressed the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. You've likely heard some say that teachers' unions in dealing with the pandemic have pursued their own interests at the expense of students and parents. So I want to get your reaction to that, particularly in the context of things that we've already brought up about coalition building and between teachers and parents and other laborers. So Stacey, I'll start with you again in about 5 minutes or so.
I am a mother. I have 3 children who go to public schools. So this whole concept that I am trying to ruin my children's life is not, just a lie. It is absolutely offensive to me as a mom. The only thing that I do have to get right in this lifetime is to make sure my kids are as healthy and as happy as they can be. And that includes, making sure that they get access to a good public education. That being said, people got a lot of nerve to talk about sending children into school communities that were inadequate and lacked infrastructure prior to the pandemic. So the theory that children would be unharmed in school communities during a pandemic also presupposes that these school communities were set up from the beginning to offer these children everything that they needed, right? So was there a school nurse in every single school community here in Chicago? Was there a social worker to help distill the upside down nature of our society at that point? Were there enough janitorial staff to keep the buildings clean? Was there enough supplies from masking to sanitizer to make sure that spaces were adequately clean, that children had that? Were there enough adults in the building to maintain the protocols that would be necessary to keep people safe? Was there ventilation that was adequate enough to ensure that an airborne virus wasn't made exacerbated in that particular building space? The answer to those questions in the communities in which I've taught in, the communities in which we serve, was no. And how do we know it was no? Because I'm seeing an uptick in COVID cases right now. I'm seeing teachers who are vaccinated get breakthrough cases of COVID, right? I get that folks wanted mothers back into the workforce and that it was tough for mothers to be in the workforce because there was a pandemic where they needed to first be mothers, right? So let's talk about the child care crisis, right? Let's talk about how unaffordable it is for me to be a mother. Let's talk about the wages that are so depressed that I don't just have one job, that I have many jobs in order to keep my unaffordable housing working. And then here's the other thing. We have documented about 20,000 homeless students who go to the Chicago public schools. How do you shelter in place when you don't have a home? Right? How many of our students had access to broadband, which should be a public utility? Right? And how many of our students had the necessary equipment? That's not the fault of the teachers union. That is the fault of a society that doesn't see the many but sees the few, and then makes excuses for why they can't fully fund public education in any entity that represents children of color. Right. So these are the real lines here. And being in coalition with families, being in coalition with grassroots, being in coalition with people outside of our union allowed us to make that case with them, because these weren't things that we were imagining. These were things that people were experiencing. Last thing, the zip codes that suffered the most infection and death were the same zip codes where our school communities have been under-resourced and depressed for generations. The same zip codes that don't have affordable housing or enough housing. The same zip codes that are surveilled and not safe. These are issues that were exacerbated by COVID, and somehow the same people who have a lot to say about how our union reacted in common good, they still haven't figured out how to serve the people in those spaces.
I want you to clarify a little bit on that last point. I'm just going to ask you if you can say a little bit more about who those people were and what that pushback was on the common good that you didn't see translating. I just wasn't sure that I understood.
Oh, no, I'm perfectly happy to explain. The common good means that we were doing more than just dropping off laptops and hotspots. It meant that we were asking, do you have food in your home? It meant that we were asking, are the adults in the home vaccinated? And what do you all think about the vaccination? It meant, do you need more emotional or social support because people in your household have been ill, or people in your household have succumbed to the virus? It meant that we were trying to see the humanity in the people who were in the school community. And what I'm saying is that there was a learning curve for government in that moment, especially if government did not see those people before. And then here in Chicago, there has been an inability of our mayor, who is in charge of our school district, to partner with those entities, the union, that have deep relationships and ties into the communities, because these are the places where our members live and work, to be honest with you. This is a group project. I've said that many times. And unless the group is working together and not cross purposes, we're never going to get out of this pandemic. We see percentages rising. It's November. We're about to go into a holiday season. What does that mean? We still haven't set up mass vaccination clinics at every single school in the city that would make it accessible for families who live in that neighborhood, right? And we're still not working in collaboration. We're still showing up at schools offering families testing before and after schools. And families are taking advantage of that because the school community through the mayor has not offered universal testing.
Thanks for that clarification. And I really appreciate what you were saying also about teachers and yourself being mothers and community members. And I think it's really especially critical for us to remember that. And it feels like that was kind of a missing piece of the discussion at a high level.
And if I may quickly, that is also a challenge to educators. That is also a challenge to our union leadership, because many of us, over 80% of women nationwide, are educators. And I know that they're mothers too. So you're telling me that I'm hurting my kids' chances as I'm on the screen with your kids? Like, explain to me the dissonance in that, in that assertion. We also have to be bold and own our space and push back on this narrative that is untrue, funded by the right, and propagated by the media.
Yeah. And so now I want to turn to Jay, and I think where I want you to pick up on the conversation is a little bit more getting at this notion of coalition building, coming back to this concept of coalition building and thinking about teachers unions working in coalitions with other community groups and family members. And I wonder the extent to which in West Virginia, what you saw was teachers unions standing in coalition with other workers saying, we want safe working environments for everyone. And because that doesn't feel like that was part of the conversation. And so I wonder also then if you feel like that could have, like, why that wasn't part of the conversation or why that wasn't happening. Does that make sense? Let me be a little bit more succinct. Do you think, and my light's about to go off. Sorry, everyone. It's like the environmentally friendly lights. But I'll ask my question again, then fix my lights. Do you think there would have been less a perception of teachers acting against the interests of students and parents if teachers had more publicly pursued a strategy of standing in solidarity with other essential workers?
Yeah, I guess my answer is maybe. I think, though, this kind of gets at something we touched on earlier when we were talking about like bread and butter unionism versus like social movement stuff. Like, I think all of us on the ground level don't really see a difference in that. And I feel like a lot of times it's the media who's kind of drawing these divisions between those things. And so I feel like it was kind of the same thing with COVID and our response with that. Just to give you an example, in the summer of 2020, before schools had reopened, our teacher caucus, the West Virginia United Caucus, began hosting some Zoom calls in the summer that we just made open to any West Virginia teacher, because there was really no plan at all yet that was coming out, and no one knew what was going to happen in the fall, and everybody was concerned. But as we were hosting these, we noticed a lot of people signing up that weren't teachers. They were just parents. And so we realized, oh my gosh, there's a ton of parents interested in this. So we started thinking, okay, let's do some that are just for parents and teachers to talk to each other. And we had like literally hundreds of parents on these calls that just wanted to talk about what the school year could look like. And, together we kind of came up with a plan and a list of things that we thought would enable us to open schools safely. And so I guess what I was seeing on the ground is that the parents care just as much about, the safe schools as the teachers. There was this narrative that like the teacher unions just want to keep the schools closed and don't want to open it. They don't care about the kids. But I mean, every parent I talked to seemed very concerned about stuff what Stacey was talking about ventilation, about having a full-time nurse, about all these things that would make the environment safe that, frankly, we've been underfunding for years. And so we have these huge gaps. And I feel like COVID just kind of made everyone more aware of it. And so, yeah, I don't know if I agree or disagree with what you're saying, but I think it gets lost in the shuffle what was really happening on the ground.
And so, Cara, I want to pass to you in about 3 or so minutes. Could you give me your reaction to some of this conversation and how you think that teachers' unions have handled the pandemic and how it's been perceived, particularly in relation to coalitions with, parents and other workers?
Yeah, I do agree with what was said before. There definitely was teachers were being villainized to a great degree. And, what was ironic, what I noticed was that while, the unions were wanted to keep schools safe, and part of that was keeping schools closed until they could be made safe. The whole narrative changed in the community that we just didn't want to work, and yet when the schools did open, there was a big racial divide as to who was and wasn't sending their students into those buildings. And we saw that, a lot of the schools with a majority of white students had more students in the classroom, whereas our neighborhoods of color really didn't. And, I don't think that was addressed to any great degree. I think it was a touchy subject that nobody really wanted to touch. I think the union was the sole voice of sort of just trying to keep everyone safe and have the narrative of, we want safety, we want mitigating strategies, we don't want schools to be open until they're ready to be open. And I think some of that was actually lost in the whole ordeal.
And so, Gia, I want to pass to you, and similar, about 3 minutes, if you could give your reaction in terms of what you experience on the ground in New York City.
New York City, there was almost a denial that the impact of the pandemic was, rearing its ugly head back in March of 2020. Teachers in several schools were, quite firmly demanding that something happen with test and trace, and there was nothing in place. The union leadership here is very different from Chicago's. And so there was also a kind of go along to get along sentiment. So literally it took us on the ground organizing a call on a Saturday. I remember it was like March 11th or something like that. And we didn't have enough room on a very large Zoom call to let everyone in. And it wasn't just teachers, it was parents. And to be very clear, to echo what Stacey and Jay are saying about the media, for us in New York City, the parent group that formed didn't have a very large teacher support. It was literally, we found out, funded by a couple of hedge funds. We know from New York City, they had tons of funding for media, for all kinds of, to do their activities, to have a website and all of this. They dominated all of the press. And it was because they were very well endowed in terms of funding. Whereas the grassroots, it was literally predominantly our Black and Brown community members and our parents, students, teachers, saying the rates of certain neighborhoods in New York City were so high, but the mayor was going off citywide averages. And it just was completely unconscionable at the time, but we fought back.
And so finally, Nancy, I want to turn to you and bring back this notion that I keep bringing up of teachers unions standing with other workers, and that as a potential mechanism for increasing labor power broadly, and also perhaps building stronger community ties by, standing together with other workers. So we have just about 2 more minutes left on this question. I wonder if you have any comments or overarching thoughts.
Yeah, I agree really that the media discourse really villainized teachers, and it was hard to find. I became very aware of journalism around education during the pandemic because it was so hard to find anything except a few kind of stories, and that were not very edifying and followed along with the dynamics that Gia talked about. I think one of the other discourses that we began to see in the media also was the problem of what is called learning loss during the pandemic, and its link, I think, those almost immediate automatic links of learning loss to remediation and more testing, and so a kind of a reductive. So when people really talked about how might we think about the substances and the experiences of young people going through schools that were open, not open, etc., we got this pretty reductive, flattened ideas of curriculum and what schooling is for, to do well on tests, and so I, as I'm sure everyone on the panel, paid a great deal of attention to the media reports of schooling and the pandemic, and again, I found it to be quite narrow, villainizing, and not really thinking about teachers in relation to other kinds of workers at all.
Thanks. Thank you, Nancy. And I want to get to the last of our prepared topics, focusing in on kind of like stepping back and thinking about these 2 different visions of teacher unionism that we've been talking about, prioritizing solidarity amongst teachers or maybe versus pursuing social movement unionism. So the question is really directly at that, right? How reconcilable are these 2 different visions of unionism? Do they demand different and even opposing tactics? For example, does one demand strikes and other forms of militant action versus coalition building with community organizations versus negotiations with local school boards? Jay, I'd like to start with your response in roughly 5 minutes.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I'm going to maybe take this a little bit of a different direction than maybe you intended, so I apologize if I get us off track. But one thing I think about with strong solidarity in unions and going the militant direction with those tactics is, I think that in itself is sometimes a way to bring about social movements and kind of change people's view of things. And I'll just give you an example. Here in West Virginia, we went on strike in 2018, primarily really over our healthcare. Just our health insurance rates were skyrocketing and our wages were flat, and it was just untenable. And, we're a very red state. I looked it up before this, and close to 70% of the state went for Trump in 2016. So when you have every teacher in the state out on strike, you can assume that a large portion of those voted for Trump, weren't conservative. But through that struggle of being on strike for days, I really saw a shift in that educators were actually beginning to talk about what they wanted to see and ways to fund this healthcare situation. And so people, conservative Republican teachers were starting to say, we need to raise taxes. We need to raise taxes on these out-of-state corporations that just keep robbing us blind. They took all the coal from us. Now they're taking natural gas. Let's raise the natural gas severance tax to fund public employee health care. And that became like a pretty standard point of view by the end of the strike that wasn't even controversial. And so you had these people that prior to the strike, I don't think would have advocated, raising taxes to fund healthcare, and suddenly are all about that by the end of it. And so I guess I'm thinking, strikes, militant action, things that promote strong solidarity, I think can actually change the people who are involved in them and help bring about those kind of social movements that we'd like to see.
I think that did answer my question, so you shouldn't have prefaced it with going a different direction. But Stacey, I want to pose the same question to you.
You can chew gum and walk at the same time. This is how I typically start the answer to this question, is that you can chew gum and walk at the same time, which means that you can negotiate a contract that represents justice, that you can create contract demands that look like justice, transformation. I think it starts with your concept of what the common good is and your power and influence to be a part of ushering in common good in your space, and that you use every tool in your box to ensure that. So I think it has to start with, how do you envision the union that you lead, the union that you are a member of, the union that you participate in? And then it dovetails into, what can our power, what can our solidarity help to create in the spaces that we occupy? So we don't limit union membership to those who pay dues. Union membership represents a wide swath of people who need justice. And we see our anchor in the school communities as a conduit to build trust, to build community, to hear people, to create self-determined demands, and to build solidarity with those who may not be a rank and file member of the union, but they are definitely a rank and file member of our school community. So I think that all of those things matter. I don't see it as a either or, I see it as a both and.
And Gia, I see you shaking your head, or nodding your head, so I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, I'll be very direct. I think it's a false dichotomy. And I've said that over and over again whenever I've been asked that question, or whenever it's been framed this way. And just for an example, the Highlander Institute, where so many of our civil rights activists and organizers got trained, is where the birth of Labor Notes came from, which is a labor organizing organization where I got most of my training. And I think of people like Polly Murray, who many folks don't know about, but was an amazing activist organizer and really got inspired through the labor movement of the 60s. And it goes back to the second question, which is about the role of the union in anti-racism, and how to dismantle white supremacy. This is the question. It's literally our actions in our work, in our daily lives, is about dismantling systems of oppression. And so I don't see it as this either or. I see it as we're doing the work together, and almost make things like Black Lives Matter or, Pride or things like that as separate movements. I was like, no, they're all together. It's intersectional.
And so, Cara, I want to give you a moment to respond to.
Yeah, we're all teachers here, so I think we all have the same idea that we can do it all, right? And we do. I agree that I think definitely contract negotiations are the bread and butter issues, are social justice issues. I mean, I think we have to remember our history where, unions were built on things like getting equal pay for women or health insurance for women, or not, firing women who became pregnant or got married. Those issues, we need to just move them into the future. And we may need to do a little bit of adjusting of our own values in order to to make connections to the social justice issues of today. But unions were built on that. They were built on social justice issues of their own day. And I believe that, we can have it all. We can have the contract. We can address issues within that are important to teachers, and which are their students' issues, and create coalitions with the community and parents in order to do that.
Thank you. And so, Nancy, now I'd like to bring it back to you to help us I think this is right up your alley. So I'm not going to give you much prompt, just take it away.
Thanks. I thought about this question a little differently. I thought about it in terms of the emotional or affective tactics rather than specific kinds of actions. And so I was thinking about tactics. Well, do we develop hope? Do we develop optimism? What about anger? What about rage? What about frustration? What about complaint? So I was sort of thinking about the whether our preferred tactics or those deemed better or more effective, presume certain emotional states or certain emotional investments. And I think I also wonder, in this, along these lines, is how teachers counter the fears, the victimization, the villainization, the deficit perspectives, the all of those kinds of that feel very much interwoven with various kind of strong emotions, and so I as a university instructor and in a graduate school of education, so most of almost all of my students are teachers, experienced teachers, beginning teachers, about to be teachers. And so I've started trying to think with them and talk with them about this sort of how we move from this kind of mobilization of emotions, right? That seems to me part of the tactics and part of what we have to think about. And I think that that's being really used in the sort of the villainization of teachers, this sort of fear of what isn't being taught, etc. I think those are really effective mobilizations of affect that end up putting teachers in a bad light and public schools in a bad light. And so in my work with students in my classes, I've begun to try to sort of talk with them about how we move from experiences of injustice with injustice to kind of activism. And I think Sarah Ahmed has a recent book out called Complaint, in which she talks about the process of complaint as really important in this kind of ability to begin to understand one's own experiences. And that complaint kind of is a building. To complain, she says, is part of a building and of an explanation of what goes into the complaint in the situation, and how we think about and how we might work from experiences of injustice to complaints to activism. And that's kind of seeing of the intersections of struggles that other folks have talked about. So I'm just interested in it, I guess, in a sense, in kind of building attachments. But I'm thinking here of emotions as a piece of those attachments to the goals of a common good unionism.
Thank you. And thank you all of the panelists so far. Now we're going to move into some questions from audience members that they submitted in advance. We are happy to say that we received a good number of questions, and so we're going to go through as many as possible. I've combined some that were related, and I'll try to kind of connect them to some of the things that we've been talking about as well. And I'll just let whoever wants to take them, and we'll just play it by ear. So first question, an audience member writes, in response to exploitative employers, we've seen a recent wave of strikes in the private sector. Do you see another strike wave amongst teachers' unions coming too? I'm going to let anyone who wants to speak. Stacey.
I'll do it because no one else was jumping off of mute. I don't know if you can talk about teachers unions and strike waves again. I think that we have led on the whole strike wave concept. You know, Karen Lewis back in 2012 with Jesse Sharkey, Michael Brunson, and Christine Maley, they pushed the door wide open. And you saw West Virginia, you saw Oklahoma, you saw Kentucky. You've seen, you know, uprisings all across this country. Folks in red, quite frankly, all across this country. In Indiana, they even did red for ed. You know, they shut it down for a day. What am I saying? I'm saying that everyone else is catching up to the teachers is how I would say that. I would say that for us, we have to continue to keep the pace. You know, in Scranton right now, we have teachers who are striking. So, you know, I guess I'm focusing more on the word wave when I would, you know, actually say that there has been a steady, you know, stream of educators throughout this country taking back their voice and their power and challenging the status quo. And one more thing about that, I think it is very important because what you see are women, working mothers, challenging this notion that you can demonize me for telling you no. And I think that's the part about what we don't talk about enough with teachers, strikes, teachers, and struggle, is that these are women telling men, because men are typically our principals, typically our superintendents, typically our mayors, we're telling them no. And so in a society that is like rooted in patriarchy, we are offensive, right? Teachers' unions are offensive, particularly ones led by women. You know, the type of vitriol that Karen had to deal with was unprecedented. And don't be a woman of color on top of that. So you are really telling patriarchy, you're telling white supremacy at the same time that they don't know about your skill, your expertise, and your ability to do your work and to have a seat. Of course, they're going to challenge. Of course, they're going to push back because that's what white supremacy and patriarchy does.
Anyone else want to comment? That was a very powerful response. I think it actually segues nicely into the next piece, especially bringing up the Scranton teachers strike. So one audience member brings up that Columbia's graduate student workers on the main campus are one of many labor organizations on strike right now. And over the past few weeks, we've probably all seen Striketober and the apparent increase in strikes recently. How can teachers and their unions support the efforts of other, particularly I'm interested in less established unions like the Columbia Graduate Student Workers or other unions that are just trying to get up off the ground or trying to get an initial contract, something like that?
I can speak to that one. I do think it's something that we as unions have to do more of. I think we need to get away from this deficit mentality of you know, what isn't, if it's not my union and not my work, I don't want to get involved because that might mean less for me somehow, or it might put a target on my back. And I think we need to do more to elevate all workers, to elevate, you know, we talk about our brothers and sisters, you know, in union parlance. And I don't see that we're always acting as vigorously on behalf of other unions, especially the ones that are you know, starting up and don't have a lot of visibility. You know, yes, the bigger organizations can give resources and provide supports, money. But I think we need to do more from that grassroots perspective. I think we've lost that ability a little bit. And I think it's something that we need to gain again. And you know, I'm trying to think of the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats, or I'm not good with aphorisms, but I think we need to have that mentality of, you know, we're all in this together. You know, that's what a union's supposed to be all about. And I do think we need to give more support, more visibility. I mean, there are lots of things you can do, even in terms of just promoting other people's issues through social media. That doesn't take a lot of time. And it can be yet very, very powerful. So I do think it's something we need to do more of.
Gia, did you also want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, when the Verizon workers went on strike a few years ago, when Spectrum workers were on strike here in New York City, more members, along in coalition with others, through labor notes, actually, we set up solidarity systems where ordered pizza. At our meetings, we invited them to come and join and speak about what they were fighting for, and just being in that space. And some of these folks would bring their kids, and they were like, these are teachers, and knowing that teachers were their parents or their child's teachers. I was trying to say a word that came out funky, but every profession we know, like when the nurses here went on strike in certain hospitals, I knew some of the parents were striking. Solidarity is incredibly important. And I do think that we have to get away from, because we hear this from the union leadership here a lot, is when we go to negotiate things like healthcare or pensions, which is done through the Municipal Labor Council, they'll often say, well, we got to get in first. We got to get, they'll even say things like, oh, they want, the unions upstate want what we've just got. It's almost like we're in competition with each other. And I really think that we need to stop doing that. We need to be like, no, I want for them what we have. So we're going to help you get that together. And I saw that happen in West Virginia with Jay, and other places. So I know it's possible.
Jay, did you want to comment as well? You seemed like you did.
They've both done such a good job saying mostly what I want to say, but just quickly, it's really easy. I mean, just go talk to them, ask them what they need. If they're on strike, go stand on the picket line with them. But if not, pick up the phone, call them, reach out to people that that are in those unions and ask, because if they're less established and trying to get recognition, it could be huge. Just little acts like that could really go a long way.
Okay, and so now to our third audience question. Taking a little bit of a different stroke, but I think still an important question where we want to get your voices. Can you give a sense of the kinds of policies you think are needed to avoid teachers' shortages among school districts right now?
So the teacher shortage, especially here in Illinois and in particular in Chicago, is manufactured by ed reform. You create a shortage by saying that we're going to turn around a school because of a test score, especially turning around schools because of a standardized test score. So you got to stop testing kids with standardized tests that they won't do well on because they are racist to begin with. Like we have to start naming it out loud and saying it. Judging students, schools, educators on a standardized test, especially if your students are non-white, is a setup to fail. So when you turn schools around and fire everyone in there because of that, or you close it down because of the test score, then you are creating the shortage that you say that you want to ameliorate, right? So you gotta stop that practice to begin with. I think too, and then you gotta stop telling me that I'm trash as a professional. You kind of gotta stop beating me up for doing the work that everyone, when the world got shut down and we were doing this every day, and parents saw that it is both an art, it is both a skill, it is both an expertise that is honed over time. You got to acknowledge that in how you evaluate me. And if you're evaluating me based on a VAM, right, based on a test score, then you're going to have a shortage. Why would any young person who is brilliant and has the whole world in front of them make a choice to be America's dumping ground? Why would that person make a choice? And then part two is, which I think is more acute than even teacher shortage, is the shortage of Black professionals that are retained in our school districts because of policies that are racist, and that they feel acutely, both as a person that feels protective of students of color, but also feels protective of their own sanity when they're in spaces that exacerbate the cognitive dissonance that you feel anyway. So you got to fund schools, so schools have the types of resources and infrastructure that define school, right? You have to, you got to reduce the power. No, you have to eliminate the power of the standardized test and penalty. And then you got to treat people well who want to do this work. And I'm not saying high five me or tell me that I'm a saint. I'm saying give me development that impacts my my pedagogy. Put me in places where my agency is felt in the policies that come at the local micro level and at the macro level. Take me seriously when I tell you what I need in order to be successful, right? Those are things, those are concrete, tangible things that can help minimize what folks are calling a teacher shortage. That's not a teacher shortage. That's people watching how teachers are being treated and making a very reasonable decision to do something else.
I think that, Gia, I wonder if you wanted to pick up on that. Stacy mentioned some specific policies that I think are really worth noting: testing and accountability, funding with regards to resources and infrastructure, and then just like treating teachers well. And I wonder if you could pick up from there. And I know it reminds me of other things I've seen you talk about.
A lot of the policies that have to do with the ed reform that Stacy's sharing comes from ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And it's Koch brothers funded, every, 1%er you can imagine, Democrats and Republicans involved. And we have to be clear about that, because these policies are designed to put into place a lean production model into a public school system. Lean production is designed to squeeze the workers. Where's the place where the bosses can squeeze and maximize profit? If teachers have a contract that determine our wages, our benefits, right? Our livelihoods beyond retirement, okay? And you look at a state's budget, we're a big chunk of our state's budget because of our contracts and pensions, etc. That's the first place they're going to attack at a fiscal economic level. Okay, so all these ed reform policies that are about choice, that are about mayoral control, right? About squeezing budgets to maximize this, that, or the other, are a bunch of BS, because they're designed to make us feel like we are working 10 jobs, to make us feel like we want to quit, to make people feel like they don't ever want to get into this profession. But this is the most important profession right now, because we are like the cornerstone of a democracy. And that's what's at stake when they come at public schools and public education. So watch who your elected officials are being funded, what policies they're supporting at the federal and local levels, because some of our union leaders, I'll emphasize New York City and New York State, support a lot of these elected officials and don't do enough to put them on, put them to task to support public education policies that support like real, meaningful, nurturing public schools and support educators to do their jobs. I'm also a parent. I take it very personally when the attack is on the educators and the folks, charged with creating nurturing environments for our students.
Mm-hmm. And do any of the other panelists want to comment on this question? I think, or this notion? Okay, I'll move to the next question from audience member. So teachers unions in cities like New York have a history that many have perceived as racist. How has or will this impact teachers' ability to advocate for racial justice? This may be our last question, so I think this is the right way to end.
So I'll take this one because I feel like I get to address this a lot in my work. And you name an American institution that is not undergirded by white supremacy or patriarchy. Name one. I'll wait. That still doesn't stop us from engaging in those institutions. It still doesn't stop us from participating in those institutions, right? And it still doesn't stop us from voting for people who will be in charge of those institutions every November, right? So this charge that I can't do union because of that is antiquated, hypocritical, and often goes unchallenged, right? Yes, labor has that past, and so does every institution in this country. So do we throw the entire country out, or are people working to try and make this country better? I would submit that the very people who have been excluded the most, demonized the most in this country, have made this country a more perfect union every time we struggle for more. So I would just challenge that notion of what it has been and what it can be. And, just continue to reflect on the fact that in this country, those who have been the most marginalized have often made their struggle, made America more democratic, made it more diverse, and made it better for everyone. Going back to Cara and talking about lifting all boats, right? The theory, if Black women get more, if they are positioned better, if they are treated better, everyone in this country will be better positioned and treated better. So I subscribe to that notion.
Other thoughts on this? I think this is a really important question about dealing with the racist past of our institutions, our labor institutions, and our political institutions. Other thoughts?
I would just add to that I know I got involved in the teachers union because I do believe that change has to happen from the inside. And I think we are, as unionists, we are the people who are best positioned to make that change from the inside. And I think it's the only way that it really can happen. So I do think we need to attend to our members' views and make the changes that need to be made within the union itself and among our own teachers. But I think we can do it. And I think it's the only way that it's going to happen.
I can add. I would say like a blanket statement around racism and teacher unions, you have to look within. Just like it's been said, repeated here, that you're going to always find groups of people who are dedicated to doing the work. I'll give an example. Once you have a chapter leader like myself, right, come into a school, that has been very oppressive. Administrator tightly controls, has divided the school. Once teachers start to organize and get a taste of hope and empowerment, when they come together to make a decision to push back against something in their school that has not served them and their students, it can be so small. Once they get a taste of that, they get just a taste of what it's like to dismantle a piece of white supremacy and racism. And that emboldens them to take it a step further and to fight for more. And it literally is that little. It can be something like getting a working copier for everyone, because we all know the impact of having a copier that's not working, or being told you have to bring in your own paper. But when everyone gets together and decides, no, we're not doing that, we're going to demand this, you get a taste of it, and you can take it even further. And we've seen it happen from school to school, from union to union, and been so inspired by our sisters and brothers across the state and the country. So we know, because we can see what's possible. And that's how we change.
So I think just before we wrap up, Nancy, if you wanted to, we're 1 minute over time. If you want to provide some final wisdom in a brief time frame.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to this discussion in response to the last question about the history of racism in teacher unions is that, we're educators. And so if I assume that educators wouldn't continue to do this work unless we believe that change is possible, and change through new facts, new relationships, new opportunities, by crises, by emergencies. All of those, I think, can play parts in kind of, fomenting and carrying change. And so, I guess I would just sort of kind of bring it back around to that common good unionism, as has been talked about tonight, is really about education. Education processes is sort of embedded in the work as well as in its outcomes, and for the nature of public schools and students. So it's about education.
And so with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, panelists, for this truly thought-provoking discussion. I have like 4 or 5 new research questions I've already written down over here. So I really, really appreciate your thoughtful responses and taking the time to talk with us tonight. Thank you, audience members, for tuning in and providing your questions. And I hope everyone has a good night. Take care.
Okay. Thank you.